Okay, looks like our numbers have settled. So thank you all for joining us. I'm really excited about this talk. But before we get started, I do want to acknowledge where I am currently. I am living, working, playing on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples. I'm incredibly grateful to be on this land, to experience this land. And I'm also really diving into my learning, and I am grateful to be learning about Indigenous ways of learning and doing. And I hope that we can all be doing the same. I really want to encourage you all to take a moment when you have some time to go and visit the Indian Residential School Survivor Society website, to educate yourself, to do some learning, some unlearning, some relearning, and if you have the means to actually make a donation to them. I am going to pass it over to our speaker, Anne. I am so excited about this topic. And I am going to stop my share and I'm going to turn all my stuff off, and it is all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. Again, thank you so much for having me as a part of the speaker series. I am presenting this webinar from the City of Toronto, and I would also like to acknowledge that the City of Toronto is situated on the territorial, traditional territories of the, pardon my pronunciation, the Anishinaabe, including the Mississauga of Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat territory. I would also like to acknowledge that even though we are looking at perception bias through the lens of sport and through a partial of my own personal experience, I do want to acknowledge that I believe that settler colonialism can be seen and felt in all of these themes, and these will be themes that we will be chatting about in just a moment. So hopefully everyone can see my screen here. So as Amy mentioned, my name is Anne. I am currently the head coach of the McMaster University Women's Varsity Program. And I am here to chat about perception bias, particularly for women in high performance sport. So just to give you all a little bit of background about me, if you don't know, most of my athletic background is mainly been in rugby. I have competed in individual sport, both in badminton. I am a non-competing weightlifter. Representation-wise, I have played badminton for Team Alberta. I've represented the Alberta Wolfpack for rugby. I've played varsity level rugby, and also represented my home country in Asia nationally for rugby sevens. Part of my coaching background, I have started off coaching and being exposed to coaching within high school rugby here in Toronto, as well as club rugby here in Toronto and in Vancouver. And in the high performance space, I've most recently worked with BC Rugby, the Vancouver Rugby Union, and with Rugby Canada. And then just a little bit about some of the items that I've been able to work on, and I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to work within coaching staffs that have been successful in developing and leading their programs. And 2018, 2019 were arguably probably my most successful years. And I can attribute that to a lot of hard work and determination in overcoming some of the barriers that we will be chatting about further on in this webinar. So some of the things that you'll be learning about as we go through this chat is, what exactly is perception bias? What are the main levels of perception bias? How do they impact women within the high performance sport? And again, even though we're looking at this through the lens of high performance, they are incredibly applicable to all levels of sport. Lastly, I also wanted to take a look at and explore whether these biases have created additional barriers to entry, and if it has, whether those barriers have had an impact on the decision to either continue on or leave sport as a whole. So to start off with, in order for us to really dive into the discussion of perception bias, what exactly is bias? So according to Merriam-Webster, the definition of bias is an instance of prejudice. So if bias is prejudice, then what does it mean to have the perception bias? Simply put, what that means is it's a tendency for someone to be subjective. And while people believe that they are imparting impartial judgments, they're generally and usually influenced in an unconscious manner through some form of bias. Some of these techniques, as explored through psychology, is used to gain short or quick understanding of a person, situation, or event, and can include projection, selective perception, and one of the more important things would be stereotyping. In having said all of those, today we're going to focus solely on the main physical aspects that an individual can experience perception bias and how they can be affected by those three main physical areas. So the three main levels of perception bias from a physical contributing factor, one would be age, the second would be gender, or what your gender presentation is, and the third would be race. And so out of all of these three things, ageism, sexism, and racism are, I would consider the three most prevalent ways that someone can experience the physical manifestations of perception bias. And we'll go through each one of these things and we'll dive into some of the experiences. So the first area would be age. And for all three of these things, there's two main questions that I really want to explore. The first is, how does this impact an athlete or a coach? And the second, does this create barrier to entry? And so in terms of age, you could be experiencing ageism. So depending on how old or young you appear to be, and whether that perception leads to conclusions that you may or may not be as experienced for your role as where you are. Is your knowledge level appropriate based on that perception? And if it's perceived to not be, is it because of the perception that your knowledge may be outdated? The second most prevalent physical perception bias area would be sexism or gender-based. And now this is, again, based on your physical gender presentation. If we're looking at the space that you're working in, so for instance, I'm working within high performance rugby, is that space a typically male dominant space? Or has there been room for a little bit of diversity? Does the appearance of your gender affect the perception of what your ability is? And so this would be most generally how an individual may experience sexism. Your physicality, or how your physicality affects how you are perceived to be knowledgeable. So for instance, I'm a bit smaller and more petite in stature. I don't physically take up a lot of room and a lot of space. And so that can be perceived as maybe my knowledge is lacking, versus with an individual that might physically take up a little bit more space. And lastly, whether you sense that there is space for you within that environment, or if it's been a typical space that has been dominated by something other than what you are presenting as. And the last sort of physical pillar is race. And again, much in the same way as gender, is there diversity, or has there typically been diversity within your space, or has it been historically dominated by the majority? That can also affect the perception of what your knowledge level is. And so in this instance, you may experience racism as a way to filter out either athletes or coaches based on the perception of who the space is appropriate and available to. And lastly, it's a sense of whether there is space for you. Are you looking around in that space and you're seeing others that look like you and present like you? Or are you at the forefront of hopefully an element for change? So as I think about sort of these three main pillars, age, gender, and race, I think about and reflect upon the experiences I've had both as an athlete and as a coach. And I think that even though those two experiences have been quite similar and some of the perception biases have certainly overlapped, I do think it's important to make the distinction of how they differ. And especially as an athlete, being able to compete as an individual versus in a team environment, how some of those things have differed. And I'll be able to highlight a few examples for you that hopefully can illustrate this point a little bit clearer for you. So perception bias can be experienced in both environments, but depending on which environment you're in could affect you in a much different way. So from my personal experience within individual sport, that perception bias feels a lot more personal and deliberate. You kind of have a really clear idea that that bias is aimed towards you. A lot of times in individual sport, if you are training with a team, it's generally for training purpose, but when you're competing, it is just you and your opponent. It's very individual. I've been incredibly fortunate that I've not experienced perception bias in sort of the traditional way within individual sport. What I can say is badminton is stereotypically known amongst the Asian community as a sport that is very popular, it's very prevalent. And so any of the bias that I have experienced competing as an individual in that sport has been born out of stereotyping. It's the idea of, well, you're Asian, so that's a very appropriate sport for you to be in. Or it's the notion of, well, that was a given that that's something that you would want to do or be good at. So we can see from there that perception bias, while maybe not coming from a malicious place or with a place of malintent, it is born out of a stereotype against a group of people for a particular sport. Even though that sport is not just based for that particular group of individuals, it's certainly stereotyped to be that way. Within team sport, the bias can feel personal as well and deliberate, but it also changes sort of how you feel about it based on the severity and also where the bias is coming from, because you are now in a team environment and it's not as individual. So depending on whether your bias is coming from your coaches, medical staff, fellow teammates, spectators, opponents, those can all have varying effects, and they can all contribute to the severity and the types of bias that you'll feel, and whether or not those biases tend to lean more into one of the three pillars that we had chatted about before, or if it is a little bit more individualistic to each one of those pillars. In both of these instances, they can affect what your performance will look like, your motivation to continue or to train hard, your personal self-esteem, and it could also influence your subsequent continuation within that environment or within the sport. The one instance that I can really recall back on that has had a profound change on my life when I sort of gone back into team sport. I guess a little known fact about me is I did compete in field hockey concurrently with rugby. And sort of at the tail end of high school going into university, those are seasons that overlap in time. And so the choice was, do I pick field hockey or do I pick rugby? And I decided to pick field hockey because at that point in time, I was finding a little bit more success in that sport than in rugby. And so I decided to put rugby a little bit on that back burner and decided to pursue field hockey a little bit more. I joined a field hockey club. I played with the varsity team at the University of Alberta. And that sort of started the journey into that sport. My club experience started off in a really positive way. Some of the girls that were on the team and in the club that I played for, I had played with in high school. So we did have a bit of camaraderie there. And the first year, we did well. We finished in the top three. Everyone's working really well together, and it's seemingly, a great environment. Everyone's being very supportive. I will note there was not a lot of diversity on that team. I believe I was one of, if not the only non white person on the team. But I didn't think very much of it because otherwise my teammates were quite supportive and it seemed like a supportive environment. Moving into my second year with that sport, we didn't do quite as well. And there was attempts at sort of making changes in the lineup and making changes within how the team is being coached to try to improve performance. I played as a goalkeeper in outdoor and as a defenseman in indoor. And admittedly, without all the equipment on, I'm not good at field hockey, but certainly not the best at it. And I distinctly remember there was one afternoon, it was during the indoor season, and my mom had gone to drop me off at training. I gave her, she went to go run some errands while I was in training, and I gave her time to come back. And my team captain said wanted to speak to me. Again, I didn't really think anything of it, so I go to this meeting, and a couple minutes after this meeting had started, they asked me to leave the team. There was really not a lot of rhyme or reason behind that decision. It wasn't a, we'll try to work on things. It was, we're not doing well, and you're in one of the positions that contributes to that. So I had to go. No one else had an individual meeting like this. It was just me. I would have been 20 or 21 years old at this time. And when I had sort of left the meeting, I had a sinking feeling that there was a little bit more to it than just performance. But I really didn't have the courage to speak up or say anything about it. And I certainly didn't have the tools or the knowledge of exactly what was happening. But deep down, I sort of knew this isn't right. And it's not something that I think should be occurring. But my mom picks me up. She asks me how training is. I tell her it's fine. And I go home. A couple weeks later, an old friend of mine who went to high school with me and we went to university together had asked if I would consider coming back to rugby. Not to join the club that I had played for before, but to come and join the club that he was at. He said the environment was really welcoming. I had sort of, told him what had happened in my field hockey experience, and he assured me that this wouldn't be the type of thing that would occur in this sport. And so I went back to rugby, and I've never looked back since. And it's not to say that there hasn't been hardships, perception bias, racism, and sexism within my experience within rugby, but what it taught me was I was able to remove myself from an environment that really made me not love the sport anymore and go back to a sport that, looking back in hindsight, has changed the trajectory of what I'm doing and where I am in it. So hopefully this sort of highlights that, perception bias as an athlete can really affect performance, your self-esteem, and then the decisions to subsequently continue in the environment. And for me, I have a lot of respect for any of my friends and any of my my former teammates that are still involved in this sport. I did not have the best experience in it, and that really did affect my decision to subsequently continue within that environment. However, it has brought about some positive change into leading me down the pathway to rugby and to where I am now. On the flip side of there, perception bias can be experienced from a coaching perspective. And much like in the athlete perspective, that perception bias can be experienced in a multitude of different environments, whether you're coaching grassroots or community-based rugby, or whether you're working in the high performance space. Perception bias can be incredibly prevalent. Ageism, sexism, and racism can be incredibly prevalent and can also influence whether or not you choose to stay in those environments or whether you pursue to either go higher up and further along, or if you choose to leave the sport altogether. So from a grassroots perspective, that perception bias can feel personal and deliberate, where you'll kind of know where that bias is aimed towards. And a lot of times it's because a lot of the roles within grassroots rugby are typically very heavily volunteer-based. and you're dealing with varying members of the broader community. And this also would depend on whether you are dealing with age grade athletes or senior level athletes. So that community can broaden if you are working with the age grade athletes, because you may be dealing with parents and families, as well as fellow teammates, other coaches, medical staff, and other senior level players. And also depending geographically where you're located, whether the club that you're at is a smaller club that is that's just starting out, or if it is a little bit more established. From a high performance perspective, the bias can still feel quite personal, isolating, and specific. However, what differs here mainly is that this environment is a bit more of a closed environment. What I mean by a closed environment is it's generally made up of a much smaller pool of athletes, coaches, trainers, and management. There's higher pressure to perform, and some of those pressures can also lead to either conscious or unconscious perception biases. And we had touched upon it just a few moments before, but age grade athletes versus senior level. And this can feel a little bit different depending on the age of athletes that you're working with. And this can also, at the end of the day, affect your passion for coaching in general. And the last thing that I do want to touch upon is whether or not you're working with male or female teams in any one of those three spaces. The biases that you feel can gravely depend on which group you're coaching and which group you're coaching at which of those levels. So from my own personal experience, I have worked in grassroots and high performance, both with age grade level athletes and senior level athletes, both with male athletes and with female athletes. And so I will say that within that grassroots rugby experience, a lot of times, you know, I got into coaching rugby because I really wanted to give back to the sport. I wanted to give back to the sport that had done a lot of really great things for me. And being able to work with the communities and being able to work with my club and give back felt like an appropriate way to do so. And I can distinctly remember, I believe this would have been 2015 or 2016. I was working with an under 14 Vancouver West representative side ahead of the provincial rugby championships in Vancouver. And it was a boys team that a lot of the boys I had coached when they were 13 or 14 at the club that I was affiliated with. And the head coach of that program had worked with me in a previous year and asked if I would have the time and would want to come and help out. And I enthusiastically said yes. And part of the reason that I did this was the normal narrative for boys, especially when they're young and pursuing sport, is a lot of their coaches have typically been male. And that's a normative sort of environment for them to be in. Female athletes, when they're young and they're starting out, that normal narrative is their coaches can be male or female. And so that's the sort of conducive environment that they've been in. And so for myself, working with a boys program, I wanted to be able to help change what that narrative of what a coach looks like and what an appropriate coach looks like. And I remember it was the gold medal game on the final day of PRCs. And I believe we're in the second half. And I'm focused on the performance of the team. And I'm on field and I'm not really paying attention to too much that's outside of the game. And what I can hear in the background is a random dad just shouts out of nowhere, "What is this woman doing on field?" And I know that he's talking about me. And I'm only really sure about this because on the opposing team, their entire staff, including their management, was male. And our entire staff, including management, was male, with the exception of myself. And so it felt incredibly specific. But again, I'm trying to concentrate on the game. And so there's not much of a reaction time for me to sort of deal with that. And then a few moments later, I heard another random dad sort of shout back at this person, that's my son's coach and she's doing great. And so silently deep down, thank you to the random dad that pointed that out. Because for him, he didn't see the perception that I was a woman that shouldn't be working in boys rugby. He just saw me as a coach that was able to coach his son to be successful. And so that's one of the ways that you can combat perception bias, is to call it out when you actually see it. Sometimes it's really uncomfortable to do, but it certainly helps. And so for me, that helped to bring my self-esteem back up. And I didn't feel like I was out of place when I was there. In the high performance space, what I can say is, from my own personal experience, the perception bias that I feel within the high performance realm of rugby is actually significantly higher now working in high performance than it would have been at the grassroots level. I attribute that to perhaps this being a more pressure-built environment. It's a much more closed and specific environment. You're working with athletes and you're working with programs that are really pressured to succeed and pressured to do well. And some of my experience I can bring back to premier level club rugby. So primarily this would have been in Vancouver. And working with one of the previous clubs that I was with, I had finished out my playing career with this club. And I transitioned into coaching with this club, both at the junior level and at the senior level. And in coaching their juniors, this club only had a boys program in juniors. It was not until a few years later that they had started to get the numbers to be appropriate to start a girls program. But prior to that, they only had an under 16 and an under 18 boys program in the junior program. And I had worked with the senior women and the senior men, with the senior men primarily as a performance analyst. And so some of my experiences within the age grade programs, again, I wanted to be able to work with the boys that were under 16, under 18, and it's to be able to help to change what that perception is and to change the narrative that, you know, women don't belong in the coaching space for men's rugby or in men's sport in general. I wanted to be able to try to change that narrative. And so if you work with athletes that are a little bit younger, and they start to see that this is becoming the norm, then that's a normative environment, and then they start to perceive you in a bit of a different way, rather than assessing your perceived knowledge based on a snap judgment that's stereotyped on either your gender, your age, or your race. What they're looking at, hopefully, is they're looking at whether or not you are appropriate for the environment, and whether or not, you know, your coaching ability is appropriate for what level that they're at and what they need as athletes. And after working with that junior program for a few years, and sort of always being talked over by other coaches, again, physically, I'm not a very large person, and so I physically don't take up a lot of space. And so it's very easy to be talked over by someone who is much larger physically than you. And so after a few years of constantly being, you know, questioned on, you know, the direction of the activities that we would be doing, talked over in drills, and so it'd be changing the directive or the objective of what we're trying to learn. I just felt really discouraged, and felt that, you know, maybe it would be more appropriate to just work in the senior level. And I think some of the boys caught on to that feeling, because some of them had asked me outside of training why I was not returning to work with them at their program. And I kind of had to assure them that it wasn't because of them that I wasn't returning. It's not because I was experiencing any perception bias or any prejudice from them as athletes. What I was experiencing was perception bias and prejudice, stereotyping, sexism, and racism from the other coaches that I worked with within that program. And again, at that point in time, I really didn't know if there was a way to sort of combat some of these things, and some of the avenues that I was presented in trying to mitigate and deal with some of these issues, I had pursued to varying degrees of success or dead ends. I would always be told, well, we're going to look into it. We'll look into that and we'll get back to you. The truth of the matter is none of that ever got looked at. It was just a hearsay so that I wouldn't bother them about it anymore. Within the senior program, I had worked with both their senior women and their senior men's program. And again, to varying degrees of success. And we had worked up to a pinnacle in 2018 where we won the division championships for the Division I women and the senior men's Premier Reserve. Both of which I've had heavy contribution into the success of those teams. Only one of those teams recognized my contribution, and that was the men's program. Within the women's program, eventually I was pushed out of the program. It was perceived that one of the younger, more experienced players had more to offer in terms of knowledge than I did, even though there was proven track record to show otherwise. And again, I wasn't 100% sure sort of where this was going to go. And I didn't want to make something out of nothing. And so I had approached my head coaches and I had approached administration within the club to let them know these are the types of things that I was experiencing. And I wanted them just to simply monitor it, just to make sure that it either didn't escalate or it didn't get out of control. And I felt like when they were telling me, yes, we'll look at that, but that was a truthful assessment of what that was, and that there was a belief that these were the things that I was feeling. And mind you, this was not a culmination of one season. This was a culmination of 3 years of the perceptions that I was not skilled enough or qualified enough to be leading the teams to where it needs to be. And someone that gravely looked different than I did without ever having worked with the team before would have better success. And what ended up happening was I left the women's program and went to solely work with the men's premier program, because the head coach there at the time understood where I was coming from, because he had also experienced perception bias, namely racism, and a little bit of ageism. And one of the other coaches that I had worked with had experienced ageism as well. They made sure that there was space for me within the men's program, and making that jump over there was one of the best things that I did for my own mental health, and also just to ensure that the passion for coaching and the passion for the sport wasn't dying, because certainly in the years leading up to this event, the passion for it was certainly waning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the barriers, but this was creating more barriers for me than creating opportunity. And it was really starting to make me question whether or not I wanted to stay in the sport at all. What I ended up doing after that was I ended up pursuing a coaching position with Capilano Rugby as the head coach of their women's primary program. And there was a lot of detractors that, would say that I would not find success, that I was well over my knowledge capability. I was too young to be leading a premier level program, and that I wouldn't be able to do well for the athletes that are trying to compete for national spots. And again, hearing that kind of bias and hearing that kind of stereotyping really did make me question whether or not I wanted to stay in the sport. It made me question whether or not I was good enough to be in the sport. And it made me really wonder whether or not those perceptions were actually true. But I wanted to stick to it, and I wanted to prove my detractors wrong. And it just meant tuning out the white noise and really just focusing on working with the athletes that were there and developing the program in a way that was inclusive, diversive, and ultimately it was towards the goals that they wanted. Not a goal that I set for them, but a goal that they set for themselves, and that was to win the championship. And that's exactly what we did in 2019. We won the BC Premier Championship, and then we went on to win the Canadian National Championship. That is not attributed just to my performance. I'm a very small part of that picture, but it's a culmination of overcoming the perception biases that I was not good enough to be there, and proving any of the detractors that someone's age, gender, or race really doesn't dictate whether or not they're going to be good at something. It's just a way for you to make a snap judgment on someone that you may not know anything about. So hopefully some of these examples start to highlight what some of these areas, barriers to entry are. And the other question that we can ask is, how can we make change? So all of these areas contribute to the barriers that are very present for women within high performance sport. In talking to other women that work in various levels of sport, one of the sort of key recurring themes that I've heard is there's not a lot of opportunity for us. Usually we'll be told that there's not enough women that work in high performance sport to begin with, but we're not really given a lot of opportunities to compete for those spots. So some of the barriers to entry can be the access to resources, the availability of positions, whether there are policies that may be outdated. So as an example, you might not have updated policies in terms of safe sport, harassment, or your code of conduct. The lack of assistance in actually trying to make change or trying to get access to resourcing or positioning, or simply just being told no without any reasoning or anything behind it. Some of the examples that I can think of that sort of speak to some of these barriers is the availability of positions and the ability to compete for them. Now, we're always told, especially when you're working within the high performance sport realm, that there's a pathway that one should be following. And that's for both athletes and coaches. An appropriate pathway that highlights development and it highlights sort of, achievement in order for you to get to the next place. And there's a notion of, you can work hard and be rewarded for that hard work. What I have found, though, is that the playing field is not always level, and not everyone is subjected to that same pathway and the same set of rules. I can think back to my experience working with BC Rugby. There's been a couple of instances where, if I'm told to submit a coaching portfolio, a sample practice plan, my resume, interview, and present out material and have the work experience to back up why I should be hired, that's all well and good, and it's part of the pathway. And my assumption, and I think anyone's reasonable assumption, would be that everyone follows the same suit. It's jarring to go to a selection camp or to go to open trial selections and just chatting with other coaches and finding out, and I don't think that they meant to slip that out, that they didn't have to do any of those things. They just had a casual conversation and was just offered a head coaching role. Whether or not, they could be 100% qualified for it, but the fact that they didn't have to do any of the other things makes me think to myself, why is it that some of the applicants have to follow the rules, procedure, and the pathway, and others get to completely bypass all of it and they don't have to do any of it? Some of the other instances is, not being selected, not because of your merit. I had applied for a coaching position. The other applicants within my pool, who I had met purely by accident, we had very similar backgrounds within sport and very similar track records for achievement within sport. And I was told, not in a personal manner, why I didn't get the job, but I found out via press release that I didn't get it. So when I went back to them to ask for feedback as to areas to improve upon, or, or things like that, what I was told was that optically it wouldn't have looked as good to hire me. And I have to wonder to myself, what kind of optics is that? How would it be optically unfair or unjust to hire me? If we're simply playing the optics game, it might have actually been better from an optical perspective to hire a woman of color versus a white male, as an example. And so their reasoning and rationale for this still to this day doesn't make any sense to me. But had I not asked the question, I would have just been told no without any reasoning behind it whatsoever. And a lot of times, women that are trying to pursue positions within higher performance sport, if they are told no, they are just being told no without any reasoning behind it. You're not being given a reason as to where you can improve, what you can be working on, you know, and things like that to try to build your portfolio. Otherwise, the positions just are not available. And so thankfully, there are spaces within sport that are starting to open up internships for female coaches. They're starting to hire more female coaches. They're starting to hire more diversity. This is just a start. So some of my experiences stems back 5 to 10 years, you know, when the question of diversity wasn't quite as much in the forefront. But I certainly think that there is still quite a long way to go in order to make this a bit more equitable. So you're probably wondering, if there's all these barriers to entry, what are some of the things that we can be doing that can enact some change? The first thing that we can do is speak about our experiences. The more that we share our experiences and the more that we talk about them, hopefully what it does is it inspires others to also have these conversations and speak within their own communities, and also to find ways within their own programs to try to enact change so that some of these experiences don't continue to occur. The second thing that we can do is to ask genuine questions about it. So going back to my example of sort of the perception bias that I had experienced before I went to Capilano Rugby, when I had left the club, with a bit of a bitter taste in my mouth. And part of it was because I had done all the things that they had asked. I had escalated it to points of contact that I was told that I could escalate it to. I had tried to resolve this within my own coaching staff. And I had tried to speak about it early, not in a way that sounds like I'm complaining, but in a genuine manner that, hey, these are the experiences that I'm having. These are the difficulties I'm having. Here are the biases that I'm experiencing. Here's the sexism and the racism that I'm experiencing. You know, I want to know that you guys are looking at it and you're doing something about it. And because nothing was ever done about it, I got to a point where I didn't want to be there anymore. And I almost left the sport in its entirety because I didn't think that I could mentally handle any more of that. What I ended up doing before the pandemic was I emailed the president of the club. I had coached his son at the under 14, under 15 level. So we had always had a really positive rapport. And I asked if their code of conduct had ever been updated. And I did preface by saying one of the reasons I asked whether or not the code of conduct had been updated in terms of harassment policy, Black Lives Matter, diversity, inclusion. I wanted to know these things because here is the reason that I left this club in the first place. And I wanted to ensure that any incoming player or athlete, potential coach, potential trainer, potential manager that would be coming into this environment would either not experience what I did, or if under the unfortunate event that they do experience that there's an avenue that they can go to gain assistance, gain resources, and resolution that's actually going to be accountable and actionable. And he came back to me and apologized for not doing enough, apologize that I went through 3 to 4 years of that environment before I just had enough and I had to go, but also updated their code of conduct and the harassment policy and made sure that I was able to actually see pen to paper in action, something that was going to change, and that there actually was an escalation pathway in the instance that some of these unfortunate instances happen again. I'm really happy that they've stuck to it, and I'm really happy that they've made genuine change. I'm also really happy that I had the courage to ask the genuine question of not coming from a judgmental place, but coming from a place of, I want to make the environment better. I want to be able to know that if I recommend a player or a coach to go to this environment, that they're going to an environment that actually says that they're doing the things that they say that they're changing, and that they actually believe in those instances, and not just saying things for the sake of saying them, but actually putting accountability and actionable items in place. That makes me really happy. And I hope that in sharing this webinar, and hopefully in sharing some of my experiences with some of these things, that it inspires you within your own broader communities to ask some of these genuine questions and speak up about your shared experience. And hopefully in us doing at least those two things, if not more, that we can actually create the change that we want to see. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and so much. I really want to commend you on your courage. I think not only your courage to share, but also your courage to speak up and make change. And I think the fact that you are actually able to make change is inspiring. But also, I mean, it's disappointing that we need to do that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We have one audience question. It's kind of a two-part question. The first part is kind of what do you think the messaging is that coaches across Canada need to hear in order to stop this bias? Like, is there a message, or is there research? What do we do?
That's a really great question. And I think as coaches, I think we want to be able to try to foster the environment that we would have wanted as athletes. So one of the key things that I'm trying to do at the master program right now is to try to build upon foundation and foster an environment that is inclusive, that is diverse, that is a safe space, because not all of those things existed when I was a competing athlete. So I want to try to foster that environment within the program that I'm working with. And that's not just the relationship between myself and the athletes, that's the relationship between them as peers, with any of my other coaches, with our strength and conditioning staff, with any of our trainers. I want to be able to try to foster that environment that's right across the board, where if there are microaggressions that are happening, if there are biases that you're seeing, that you're not scared to actually speak up. And I think as long as you're coming from a genuine place of, you know, either curiosity or a genuine want to understand what is happening, the reception is going to be much more positive than otherwise.
Yes, I think that's such an important point of creating that space where it is safe to have a voice and actually speak what your experience is, and advocate for that change. So,
yeah.
Yes. And then the second part is, do you have any suggestions for education or training for coaches?
Yes, there are a multitude of different training and things that you can take. And so most recently, I've sat in on panels and discussions surrounding safe sport. I think that that's a really prevalent area that not a lot of folks either fully understand about or are as knowledgeable on how to go about implementing a safe sport program within your program. You know, what to do if you are witnessing areas of harassment, whether that's, you know, between peers, teammates, or between another coach and a teammate, perhaps it is, a traveling team that is coming about. How do you mitigate that? How do you manage it? There's a ton of different workshops. There's a ton of different seminars and webinars. The other thing is I can also encourage to ask the questions from your provincial and your national sporting organizations. What are they actually doing? Because again, some of the action can be seen as performative. And so if you're speaking out about diversity, are you only speaking out about it because it is a quote unquote very hot sort of topic that's trending at the moment? Or is it because you're speaking out because you wholeheartedly believe that that is something that needs to change? So those are the two sort of like big suggestions that I could think of right now.
Yes. And thank you for bringing up safe sport. It's such a, it is something I'm very passionate about. I recently took I think it's the coach.ca safe sport or CAC. So good.
It's really good. Yeah.
I think everyone should do it. And that actually leads me to my question, because I know within the Canada West and in youth sport, there is no safe sport policy. And I'm wondering, are you OUA? Is that?
Yes. So I'm in the OUA. Currently, we also do not have a definitive safe sport policy. But thankfully at McMaster, there is an initiative to build one.
Okay.
So I'm hoping, and part of that work is a lot of the coaches across all of the varsity sports recognize that safe sport is something that is very imperative. It is an area that perception bias can actually lead to, physical harassment or physical altercation if sort of left unchecked and sort of unmanned. And so at least at our institution, we are taking that initiative to say, these are policies that are needed. These are policies that our coaches really need to understand. Some of these policies, if they exist within our national sporting organizations, can help to guide that sort of discussion in that collaboration. But we recognize that it is something that's needed, that is lacking throughout youth sport and throughout the different divisions within youth sport. So what I'm hopeful for is, hopefully we're not the first and only institution that's doing this. If we are the first, I hope that others will follow suit. If we're not the first, I hope that others that haven't started to look at this will think about, enacting their own safe sport policies.
Yes, I know at UBC it is very, very grassroots. I had a meeting with them, but it's something that I think needs to be done. And I think there was just recently a provincial or federal announcement that they're going to actually establish a proper hotline, which I think is massive. So
yeah, I think that's going to be really great. And I think it's something that we really prevalently need. And unfortunately, a lot of these things are starting to come about because of the very high profile cases that are being exhibited. And sometimes it really does take some of those sort of bigger high profile cases to sort of push along the agenda a little bit more, which is incredibly unfortunate. That's what it takes to really create change. But what I'm hopeful for is that these are positive steps in that direction. And I'm hoping that other institutions are starting to recognize that if this is being done at sort of a federal national level, that it's something that needs to trickle down, especially as we're working with athletes that are, that are trying, some of them, to play nationally.
Yes. Yeah. I am so hopeful. I know we both sat in on the talk out of UCLA, and I think it was so eye-opening for me in terms of what they're doing down in the US, and we've got some work to do. I just want to say thank you one more time. I really appreciate you sharing your story, and I am really inspired. And yes, let's go get rid of this perception bias. I like the amount of times where I was like, yep. So many notes, so many anger feelings. So thank you. I'm going to say thank you to everyone who stuck with us and watched. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I encourage you to check out the other talks, especially if you're interested in safe sport. And Shay's going to talk about consent culture, which is big. And Tanisha, I think Tanisha's talk tomorrow, it's going to be fantastic. She's going to talk about establishing cultures and racism and all of those things. So going to be great.
yeah, it's going to be great.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. I hope you go celebrate.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who attended.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.